Good afternoon, and welcome to our Simon alumni webinar with Cliff Smith, the Louise and Henry Epstein Emeritus Professor of Finance and Economics at the Simon School. I know many of you, but if you don't know me, I'm Jim Brickley. I'm the Senior Associate Dean of Faculty and Research and the Gleason Professor at the Simon School. So I have the incredibly easy task of introducing my good friend and colleague, Cliff Smith. I think most of you know him, and many of you had the pleasure and the privilege of being able to have him as an instructor. Cliff's research career is truly monumental. He has over 100 articles in top journals, 15 books on topics relating, on topics in finance, economics, and accounting, also law. I looked at Google Scholar today, which keeps track of citations. Cliff has been cited more than actually 63,500 times. In fact, just last year alone, he had nearly 6,000 citations. He's served on the editorial boards of major finance journals, and I might put in a plug, including the Journal of Financial Economics, which we're proud to say was founded at the Simon School. Cliff has also a history of consulting with major corporations, and he served as the chairman of the board of a New York Stock Exchange listed company. As many of you know, you probably voted for him. He has over 30 outstanding teaching awards. In fact, he has so many teaching awards that we thought it was just easier to name an award after him. So the award in the Executive MBA program for outstanding teaching now is the Clifford Smith Award. Cliff, you've done it again. We have over 550 alumni registered to hear your top 10 concerns this year. So I'm going to turn the mic over to you and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Well, thank you, Jim. And thanks for the people that are taking time out of their afternoon to join me today. I got to admit, I miss teaching. And so this is about as good as it gets for me now. I'm going to try and provide a few comments that some of you find stimulating. So let's get started. First, unemployment. This can be a real problem, and there's a huge opportunity cost associated with having people that would like to work, like to be productive, but currently don't have something that fits. Today's circumstances seem somewhat unusual, however. Today's unemployment rate's about 3.5%, and by historical standards, that's a low figure. Now, you might think that the goal would be zero unemployment. Even if that were attainable, I don't think it would be ideal. There are a couple of reasons for that. There's something that economists call frictional unemployment. And for a country as large as the US, if someone's moving from a job in one place to a job in another, they're counted as unemployed while they're in transit. So if people are changing jobs in appropriate ways, there's still going to be some unemployment around. Moreover, people that say, I'm going to spend some time searching for the best fit, they're unemployed in that process as well. Now, ultimately, unemployed workers represent available talent for a business that's undergoing expansion. But let's face facts, while a pool of unemployed workers might be socially valuable, if you're in that pool, unemployment can be personally sort of harrowing. Now, my basic concern is, although this number is low today, the government has announced plans to slow the economy, and that would generally result in a higher unemployment rate. To avoid this kind of dislocation, I told my three, look, I'll pay for all the education that you can stomach. I don't have any PhDs among my kids, but I will tell you that all three have Simon MBAs. Anyway, my advice, maximize control of your career by continuing to invest in skills and knowledge that are broad and flexible. That way, no matter which way the job market turns, there's a comfortable place for you. Educational expenses. You know, when I went to college back in the Pleistocene, and when I went to graduate school, costs were things that you could measure in tens of thousands of dollars. Now it's in hundreds of thousands, and those costs can represent major barriers, especially to people with fewer resources. Now, those high costs, at least in part, occur because education is an industry that has realized really modest technological improvements over the half a century that I've been involved with this stuff. Let me give you an example to mull over. There was this young physics professor, and the dean comes into his office and tells him that the person that normally taught the introductory physics class was sick, had to be replaced, and this young fellow had been selected as the replacement. Now, it was 2 weeks before the class started. He hadn't taught that course before, and so he found himself thrashing around to try and figure out how he's going to teach this course. In this process, he found that the introductory physics class at Caltech had been taped, and those videos were available. What he decided to do was to require the students to watch the videos before each class, and then during class time, he ran the class as a help or a review session. Now, the outcome of this somewhat unusual process was student satisfaction, as well as his teacher ratings for that class, were really quite high. Now, I've got to admit, I don't know if that model would work perfectly across different universities and even across different departments within a university. But given the improvements in technology, a lot of which were forced by COVID, if it would work, I think there'd be profound changes in the higher education process. Now, over my career, if you thought about two important components of my job, it was teaching and research. Now, teaching is something that locally people have a good handle on, but it's hard to evaluate from a distance. Research is easier to evaluate from a distance. And so competition for good faculty put a bigger premium on research than it did on teaching. If, on the other hand, you've got this market test, you've got people signing up using their course, you'd find the best teachers, not just the best locally, but out of a national pool. For a given faculty member, instead of teaching dozens of students, a superstar teacher might wind up teaching thousands of students. And I've got to believe that salaries for these superstar teachers would be dramatically higher. On the other hand, those for an average teacher are likely to be lower. And that kind of innovation might lower the overall costs of education. Trump, Biden. We're facing a presidential election in 2024. Now, some argue that the current frontrunners for our next presidential election are, in fact, Trump and Biden. And I have to admit, I've got concerns about both. Trump encouraged storming the Capitol. And when that was happening, he sat on his hands. He failed to send additional forces to stop it. Now, different people might disagree reasonably, but in my opinion, he belongs in the big house, not the White House. Biden is in a different set of circumstances. Right now, he's the oldest sitting president in the history of the country. And if he were to mount a successful run for re-election, in another 6 years, presuming he lasted that long, he would far exceed the old record. Now, when I was on the Home Properties Board, we stood for election each year, but we still had age limits. And part of the reason for that is going through the process of telling someone that they're slipping and would not be renominated is admittedly a painful process. Nonetheless, these are important decisions that the political parties have to make. And for those reasons, I'd argue that neither of these gentlemen should be nominated. Immigration. This seems to be one of those hot button topics. So let's talk about different facets of the immigration problem. I think it's important to recognize that by and large, the US was settled by immigrants. And some would point to that fact to explain the noteworthy success of our country. I mean, immigrants represent a group with more initiative and a greater willingness to take risks. For today, however, I want to focus on just two kinds of immigrants. First, those that move for greater work opportunities. And second, those that move for access to more extensive social programs, welfare programs, aid to families with dependent children, food stamps, rent assistance, heat assistance, and charities provide food cupboards, donated clothing opportunities, and so forth. I mean, by all measures, US citizens are really quite charitable. Now, my first type of immigrants make us better off. My second type, not so much. Another immigration issue, and this strikes close to home if you're in the educational community. I mean, our higher education system on a worldwide basis is at the top of the heap. Our system attracts some of the best and brightest students from around the entire globe. These people have families that have already invested heavily in their upbringing and education, and a number of these students would, after graduation, like to stay and work here. But upon their US graduation, these exceptional people are routinely sent home or given 2, or maybe with a STEM degree, 3-year permissions to work. To me, this seems crazy. Now, trying to solve these problems are clearly difficult. You know, after running a presidential campaign criticizing Trump's immigration policies, Biden has really initiated surprisingly little change in that dimension. You know, I've been asked to give my top 10 concerns for a number of the past few years. And I didn't want Jim pulling out and replaying the tape from last year or the year before. Some of you have been kind enough to tune in on more than one occasion. So I thought that one thing I might do this year is to reach out a little further from my normal set of issues. So bear with me here. When the Supreme Court settled the Roe versus Wade case, access to abortion was changed. And the recent repeal by the Supreme Court has engendered more changes. Now, let me just say to begin with, I really don't care which side of this debate you might fall on. I do want to argue, however, these restrictions represent bad law. Now, I'd like to think my reasoning is straightforward. It goes back to the first observation: we simply do not have enough police to make people obey the law. Our basic legal system works because, by and large, most people voluntarily obey laws. But when faced by laws that they feel passionately about and disagree with, we can face big problems. When large parts of the population quit saying, well, this is the law, I'll obey it, but start asking questions like, do I agree with this law, and should I obey this law? The scope of these questions expands over time, and lawlessness on a broader basis increases. I would argue that without a clearer consensus, it's my belief that laws constraining access to these medical procedures is just a bad idea. When you go out and poll people about their opinions, it ends up being around a 50-50 split. The Federal Reserve and a soft landing. Well, most discussions about the Fed's engineering of a soft landing focus on the Fed's control of interest rates. But as a matter of fact, the Federal Reserve directly controls precisely one rate. And that one rate is the discount rate at which banks can borrow from the Fed. And one of the complications here is that's really not a clean rate. If a well-functioning, well-capitalized bank were to show up at the discount window and ask for a loan from the Fed officers can demand a detailed explanation for why they're there and why the Fed ought to be making them that loan. And they're not bowled over by an argument that says, well, there are arbitrage opportunities out here. I can borrow cheaply from you and turn around and lend it to customers and pick up basis points in the process. Anyway, the Fed can come in and harass is probably too strong a word, but they can harass bankers, make life so miserable that they decide borrowing from the Fed's just too expensive, not because of the discount rate, the explicit rate that's charged, but because of all of these non-pecuniary costs. Now, while there's one rate that the Fed can control completely, they can affect a broader array of rates more indirectly through its control of the money supply. Controlling the money supply affects inflationary expectations and that affects nominal interest rates. However, that linkage is not completely rigid. There's some slippage. From the perspective of the economy as a whole, the things that they can do represent a somewhat narrow set of control mechanisms. And expecting the Fed to navigate a soft landing, to me, is something like expecting an airline pilot to navigate a soft landing with half the plane's engines out, no rudder, and no ailerons working. Now, in addition to the problems that I've already alluded to, the Fed's control over the money supply has, quite frankly, gotten more complicated over the past few decades because of various technological advancements in financial markets. Now, historically, most bank customers obtained liquidity from the asset side of their balance sheet, either holding cash or having bank balances. But to be honest with you, as I'm trying to manage liquidity for my household, I get most of my liquidity from the liability side of the balance sheet. I access my line of credit at the bank. In addition, credit card use has reduced desired cash holdings. And if you were tuned into the discussion that the Dean and Jim Brickley had last week, cryptocurrencies have the potential to, if anything, exacerbate those problems. The bottom line, in my mind, is that fewer controls means less effective ability to pilot a soft landing. I have to admit, I'm skeptical about their ability to be completely successful in that effort. The debt limit and the overall financing of government deficits. Now, let's start out with a really simple statement. If we were to default on our payments to lenders, it would simply be a disaster. One that would be unavoidable if the debt limit is not raised. Now, I'm willing to admit that there's politics that's going on in the House and the Senate, and I'm not going to be shocked if there's some brinksmanship involved in the politics of reaching a resolution, but failing to reach an agreement would be not just disastrous, it would be, in my mind, inexcusable. Now, we've been running deficits since World War II, and those deficits ultimately have to be financed. And the major ways that these deficits are financed are through taxes or through borrowing. Now, 200 years ago, the English economist David Ricardo argued that, at least under certain conditions, this choice would not matter at all. And for people that had my corporate finance course, you can think of this as the Modigliani-Miller theory for public finance, of course, except that Ricardo was a century and a half earlier. Now, among the implications of Ricardo's insights is it's more important to focus on government spending than on the deficit itself, which brings me to my next concern. That has to do with overall government spending and the forecasted congressional gridlock that the most recent congressional elections have produced. Now, if you want to take a step back and describe an optimal government spending program, that optimal program is actually fairly easy to describe. You'd only take projects that citizens collectively value at more than they cost. Again, going back to finance, from society's perspective, they're positive net present value projects. Now, although that criterion is easy to state, it's frequently violated. A simple example, currently under construction is a very large naval ship that the Pentagon flatly says they don't want. Now, how on earth could we be investing billions in building something for the Navy that the Navy doesn't want? Ultimately, this occurs as a product of what some people refer to as log rolling within Congress. This happens, in this case, members of Congress who have shipyards in their districts say, this is really important for my district. It's going to generate a bunch of jobs in my district. This is going to generate a bunch of income for my voters. Now, by themselves, they can't pass the project, but they start knocking on doors and cutting deals with other members of Congress. And the deal's pretty straightforward. If you vote for my pet project, I'll vote for your pet project. Let's swap votes. Now, this process has resulted in the congressionally authorized purchase of what amounts to a lot of pork. Now, some people have forecast that with a Republican majority in the House and a Democrat majority in the Senate, that the next 2 years are going to be typified by congressional gridlock and that little is going to get done. I've got to admit that my perspective is somewhat different. Most projects that have a high social net benefit have already been initiated. Much of what's left fails that test. And if a project gets in, if with a gridlocked Congress, a particular project gets approved, it's more likely to pass the criteria that I started out with, namely that it's a positive net present value project. So from my perspective, this congressional gridlock might be a good thing by refocusing spending on those things that collectively make us better off. Taxation. Now, I was an economics major as an undergraduate. I got my PhD from an economics department. And throughout that 8 years, the macroeconomics classes that I took, both in college and graduate school, taxes were recognized, but they weren't talked about in much detail. It was really discussed at a very high level of abstraction. It was generally reduced to, well, what's the marginal tax rate? But after spending 45 years at the Simon School, it's the more detailed structure of the tax code that I find both fascinating and useful. Let me share a couple of examples. In 2000, my wife and I bought a cottage in the Finger Lakes. Now, at that time, in the way the estate tax was set up, there was an exclusion amount in the law, but it was at a much lower level. I decided instead of holding the claim on the cottage directly, I'd put it in an LLC. And that year I started gifting LLC shares to my 3 kids. At this point, I don't own the cottage anymore. My kids do. And that means if I want to use it, I've got to pay them rent. Net, 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 we're still better off. It's out of my estate, and so it's less likely that estate taxes are going to have to be paid because what's left in it is a smaller value. When I was at the U of R, I was incurring both New York state taxes as well as federal taxes. And over that 45 years, I contributed as much as possible to my retirement account. After retiring, my income's lower. But more important, by moving from Rochester to Tampa, I reduced my income tax rate by more than 10%. Florida has no income tax. So I contributed when I was faced with higher tax rates and now withdrawing, facing lower rates. If you go back and do the math, the ideal set of circumstances is you manage your affairs so that your effective marginal personal tax rate is equal across different time periods. Now, this is perhaps more than a footnote, but one of the things that Trump did when he was in the White House is he eliminated the deduction of state taxes for your calculation of adjusted gross income. Now, just to put some numbers on this, before, if I was in a 40% federal tax bracket and a 10% state tax bracket, the effective rate was 6%. I got to deduct the state taxes. Now, 10% is 10%. Another example, when my kids initially took jobs after college and again after they completed their MBAs, I suggested maximizing contributions to a Roth retirement account. Their income was lower. It was only going to be income for the half a year after graduation. That suggested that with lower adjusted gross income, they'd be in lower tax brackets. And since in a Roth account, you contribute on an after-tax basis, you pay the taxes first. If you can load up those payments in periods where your tax rate is unusually low, the subsequent benefits are magnified. There are a couple of other wrinkles with respect to a Roth that I think are important. The required minimum distribution in a Roth is 0, as opposed to the required minimum distribution in a standard 401k, 403b, IRA account. Now, after I established myself as a Florida resident a couple of years ago, I converted almost half of my retirement assets to a Roth. The tax payments that I made reduced the assets in my estate, again, reducing the likelihood that I'd have to pay estate taxes. And the other benefits, I get tax-free income. I can I can leave in my will, I can leave those Roth assets to my kids, and they can hold them for an additional 10 years after I'm gone. Now, I don't have a crystal ball, and not everything that I tried worked. When I was on the board at Home Properties, I took advantage of a provision that was in the director compensation package. And that is, I took most of my director compensation in the form of restricted stock. Now, my calculation was I'd hold those shares while I was still a New York State resident. After I retired, my income would be lower. After I retired, I'd move to Florida. After I retired, my state income tax rate would go from over 10% to 0. But best laid plans, a private equity fund came along, made a very attractive offer to buy the firm. And this occurred prior to my retirement. And so this brilliantly conceived way to take advantage of details of the tax code didn't actually work out. Anyway, I hope these examples prompt you to have a more careful management of your tax liabilities, and maybe I've given you some ideas here that would help get that process started. Okay, my number one concern has to do with what's going on in the Ukraine. To me, this is the scariest item on my list. Putin appears to have solid control of the government in Russia, including control of the military. And quite frankly, I just don't understand some of the moves that the man has made. Now, he invaded Crimea, which is part of the Ukraine, in 2014. And that process took about a month. In truth, there was really very little pushback by the West. In fact, France was the major objector. Now, this is just an aside from watching too much cable TV, but in analyzing World War II, there are a number of scholars that suggested that when Hitler invaded the Sudetenland with very little pushback from the West, he was emboldened. And some have gone on to argue that perhaps if he had met a more united Western Front, not only would he have withdrawn from the Sudetenland, but much of the later aggression might have been forestalled. And, ideally, World War II might have been avoided altogether. I worry that too little resistance by the West could embolden Putin, cause him to go further than otherwise he would. Now, so far, the sanctions imposed on Russia, the sanctions imposed on Putin, the sanctions imposed on the autocrats that support Putin seem to have failed to move his position. Lobbying by mothers of dead Russian soldiers has failed to move him. The lack of volunteers for his army and the large number of people of draft age that have defected have failed to move his position. The Ukrainians have been careful in documenting war crimes, and although it's not clear how those charges might be adjudicated, this process also seems to have failed to move him. The Ukraine had applied for admission to NATO prior to the Russian invasion. And one of the things that I haven't seen but would like to is a serious discussion of NATO moving on their application for admission. Now, announcing admission as of, let's say, May 15th might cause Putin to decide it's one thing to fight the Ukraine, it's another to fight all of the members of NATO. I'm going to withdraw. On the other hand, Putin might start dropping nuclear bombs. Now, I'm no military expert and I don't pretend to understand the probabilities of those two outcomes. So I can't tell you definitely you should or definitely you shouldn't make this move. There are things that the last year has taught me in fairly clear ways. The picture of a mighty, an invincible Russian military force, that vision's been shattered. Now, I wish I could see a more constructive path out of this mess, but when you're dealing with someone that's unpredictable as Putin has been, that seems like a difficult goal to achieve. Well, those are the ideas that I wanted to talk about. Thanks for listening. Jim, let's turn to the Q&A.
Okay, let me get my video going here. So Cliff, that was very interesting. I got a number of comments saying that it brings back fond memories of your former students. So thank you very much. Prior to the event today, during the registration process, we received over 24 questions in advance, anticipating some of the things that you might talk about. And not surprisingly, a number of the questions were related to one another. So I sort of grouped them into more general questions that relate to what was being asked. So let me ask you the following. You've done this a number of years now where you talked about the top 10. Looking back at last year's top 10 concerns, how do you think they played out? And do they factor into the concerns you just expressed for 2023?
Well, I got to admit, there's some similarities in things that I was worried about 3 years ago, 2 years ago, last year, this year. Probably going to be worried about them next year. Has the deficit gotten any smaller? I don't think so. Has government spending, at least over the first 2 years of the Biden administration, gotten more focused on positive net present value projects? I don't believe so. Again, I don't really have a crystal ball. I will admit that I looked at those questions that you poured over and was intrigued by the number of people that said, Cliff, can you tell us what's going to happen to the stock market over the next 12 months? Or Cliff, can you tell me what's going to happen to interest rates over the next 12 months? Or Cliff, can you tell me what's going to happen to foreign exchange rates over the next 12 months? And I was just going to be forced to admit that my crystal ball's in the shop and I've got no more idea than I would have had last year this time. Those are hard questions. And if you took a capital markets finance class, you ought to know that that market is pretty darned efficient, and expecting at the beginning of the year either wild gains or dramatic losses is not an easy task. Anyway.
Well, since you're on the topic of crystal balls, I do have a question, or actually it was one of the questions we received from an alum that asked you to predict the future. It's a little bit different question. I'd be interested in hearing your answer to it. What do you see as the future of cryptocurrency? You touched on that briefly, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, here over the last couple of weeks, Bitcoin has been on the front page of a number of financial publications. And, you know, it seems to have crashed and burned. You spent a reasonable amount of time talking about organizational problems and the way they set things up. I might take a step or two back and say, look, you've got this technological innovation. You just can't walk over to the library and check out a book on the optimal way to structure cryptocurrency contracts, cryptocurrency firms, cryptocurrency markets. And what's happened here is what happens frequently. And that is you got different people that try different things. I was doing some work for Chase Manhattan Bank back when swaps markets were just starting. And I thought that the way they handled that was interesting and perhaps instructive. They set up a swaps desk in New York, another in Toronto, another in London, and another in Tokyo, and said, go to work. They didn't make exactly the same contracts. They didn't structure hedging programs exactly the same. After about 6 months, they said, you know, the program in Toronto is not as effective as the one in New York. We're going to merge that desk into here. They set things up and said, let's have some competition among various offices within the bank. And to me, this looked like an internal application of what in the book that you and I wrote with Jerry, we referred to as economic Darwinism. That ultimately competition is something that's going to produce a more effective set of contracts, set of organizations for firms, more effective sets of markets. And along the way, there are going to be some losses. You're going to have things that people try that don't work. The critical thing to stay focused on is that those things that appear to succeed not only get a bigger share of the business, they get copied by other organizations. And so the fact that Bitcoin seemed to blow up in people's faces was not completely surprising. I mean, I'm not sure that I would have forecast that it would have been Bitcoin that would have blown up. But this idea that there are going to be losers along the way is something that happens in almost every financial or organizational innovation.
All right. The thing I talked about was the blow up of FTX. That was a big collapse at we talked about at the last webinar. Let me ask you another question. You mentioned technology, and there is a question that was raised by one of the alums. That's an interesting one. What do you see as the implications of generative artificial intelligence? That's like ChatGPT, that generates the content when you ask it questions. What do you see the implications of this on management, managerial economics, the world of business?
What you're talking about is at some level a really smart robot that is very, very good at a somewhat narrow range of questions. If you go in an automobile plant today, instead of people welding various parts of the car together, you've got a machine that will do it over and over and over again in very precise ways. And oh, by the way, they don't take weekends off. They don't mind working the third shift. There's some big advantages to that kind of technological innovation. And the people that get displaced are going to be folks that are in lower skilled, more repetitive kinds of tasks. I think that that's the kind of thing that you're going to see, not just in a manufacturing context, but here this AI is displacing people in various kinds of office functions, like running a help desk, because you get similar questions that come back over and over and over again. As I tried to say earlier, if you're only able to do a narrow array of tasks, you're in a much more vulnerable position to be displaced by a really smart machine. This is not a new problem. If you go back and look at the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, there's stories about workers in a Dutch textile mill throwing their wooden shoes into the machinery because they were upset that what had been more of a home-based production process was being displaced by these larger, ultimately more efficient looms. Now, if your livelihood was tied up in having a loom at home and making cloth, that career was imperiled. But if you take two steps back, people that had been doing that are now freed up to do other things. And to me, that's the biggest takeaway from these kinds of technological innovations, that people get freed up from boring, repetitive tasks to do things where creativity, the ability to think on your feet has more of a premium. And one of the reasons that that doesn't bother me very much is it seems to me that it shifts the demand curve for people that are our graduates. It shifts that demand curve to the right.
Yeah, I was thinking that myself as you were talking. So yeah, thank you for that insight. Don't have time for too many more questions. We got one from the audience here that, you were on the board of Home Properties. You've thought a lot about real estate. The question is, hey, Professor Smith, can you kindly touch upon the real estate market? The interest rates being high have driven demand lower, resulting in lower housing prices, or I might add somewhat lowering in some markets. Is it a good time to invest in real estate?
Well, if I turn the clock back, all three of my kids have been in the market for houses over the last several years. And 2 or 3 years ago, I was pushing them to do that in a more expeditious way. It just seemed to me that what had happened to the money supply, it had grown at rates that were high enough that at least my inflationary expectations were high, and therefore my expectations about what was going to happen to mortgage rates was high. And I'm pleased that all three of mine have mortgages that were locked in at dramatically lower rates than they could replace them with today. On a go forward basis, there's a huge question here about how successful the Fed's going to be in ultimately lowering rates and engineering this soft landing. I have a number of investments in real estate. I think that as part of an otherwise reasonably well-diversified portfolio, there's a role for that to play, and that role is going to be larger if the tax treatment of real estate is something that you're particularly well suited to take advantage of. So, I'm not going to tell you that there's a gold mine, a pot of gold at the end of that rainbow, but it's certainly an asset class that I'd be looking at carefully. I do look at carefully. I have invested in. I hope that might help.
Yeah, well, thank you. We have just about a minute left, so I'm going to ask you for a short answer on this one. But you mentioned taxation, and the Biden administration has suggested increasing the taxation on stock repurchases to get companies to reinvest the money. And in the Wall Street Journal today, I was talking about record stock repurchases. Do you think this tax on stock repurchases is a good idea?
No. Look, there are a number of ways that firms can distribute free cash flow. One is to pay regular cash dividends, another is to engage in repurchases. A problem with dividends is they're not terribly flexible. I mean, if you're having dividends at this rate this year, it's very likely that you're going to have it at that rate plus or minus a little next year. Share repurchase are the things that you can turn on and off. You've got a lot more flexibility if there's more variability in the firm's prospects. I hate to see that choked off.
Okay, well, thank you. So Cliff, this was great. Enjoyable as always. I remember why when I first came to Rochester, first thing I did was sit in on your class. I'm sure the alums out in the audience are very appreciative. So thank you. Also, thank you in the audience for joining today and raising some good questions. You will soon see, if you want to listen to this or think about it some more, we will be putting this and featuring it on the Dean's Corner blog in the near future. So thank you very much and have a great 2023.
Thank you.